John's band. All right, if you read the title of this video, you already know probably what I'm getting at by playing that song. I'm going to tell a little story, which I think is one for the ages. At least it was highly impactful in my life in a certain sense, and I think it's a very interesting story, which I only recently kind of I got it right. Like I put the connected the dots of the story, which I hadn't before, and probably there's more to the story too that I'm not even getting yet. But the story is this: that I went to this largely Jewish summer camp when I think I was 12 years old, and I had, maybe I was 11 at that point. I think I was 12, somewhere between 11 and 12, and I had recently really gotten into the guitar, and I had brought with me a PV with the amp in the case. And this is, I got this in like 1981, so it was a 1981 PV with the amp in the case, which I thought was really cool. And I was fairly precocious, and I played the guitar a lot at that point. But really, the story I want to tell is that I was in this bunk with these kids who were all big into music. There were probably like 4 of them that were really super into the Beatles, and there was this one one nerdy kid named David Cohen. David, if you're out there, probably not, but if you're listening, hey. Anyway, this one nerdy kid who was highly intelligent, he was super into the Grateful Dead and other bands, but the Dead was the biggest band for him. Whereas for these other kids who were also super intelligent, and they also loved music, but they were, for them the Beatles was the biggest thing. Although there were definitely other musicians. And I just want to mention that one of these kids is a guy named Mark Spitz, who later he wrote a biography of David Bowie. And he was into Bowie even at that point. This is we're talking 1981, 82, probably 82. But years later, he wrote this biography of David Bowie. And he actually, Mark died young. I think he died in 2017. He was only 47 years old. I don't know how I found this out, but I think I heard that he had written this book about David Bowie, and I was wondering if it was the same Mark Spitz. And we kidded him about his name because of the Olympic gold medalist named Mark Spitz. So I actually was like not really friends with all these guys in the bunk so much. I was a loner. I was very much a loner. I was at that point I was either playing my guitar or jacking off in bed. Honestly, that was really what I was doing. But I was doing things at the camp. But that's what I remember. Anyway, the story is that these guys are like so into the Beatles, and they were always talking about the Beatles, or they were also into Wings, Paul McCartney's band after the Beatles. And one day, David Cohen, who I was friends with more than anyone else in the cabin, and he kind of pulled me aside and he was like, "Don't listen to those guys. The Beatles, are they're not the best. The Dead is the best." And then what he did was he said, "Listen to this song," and he played Uncle John's Band for me. and recently I was just thinking, it's funny that he played Uncle John's Band, because who are the Beatles but Uncle John's Band, man? John Lennon was the band leader of the Beatles. So it's kind of funny that he played that song for me, as like, this is the real thing right here. So I just wanted to kind of start talking about this thought, which I'm sure has been discussed before. People call the Beatles the greatest band in history, and according to the numbers, that's true, right? According to, if you look at the Beatles' impact on the world and on the 60s and on the music and on fashion and on all these other things, the Beatles definitely had probably the biggest impact of any group of any time that we are aware of. Now, on the other hand, I want to bring in the Grateful Dead. In a sense, the Grateful Dead are right up there with the Beatles, right? And also had the same timeline as the Beatles, more or less. They might have started playing a little bit after the Beatles. We're talking about San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury. But I think they got into LSD, for example, before the Beatles. I think the Beatles got into it. George and John got into it in like 65, I believe. I believe that the Dead, I'm going to have to check this, but I believe that the Dead started using it a little bit earlier than that. Not that that means anything, but they both were pioneers in acid rock. This genre called acid rock, which is also called psychedelic rock. And they both had this, they started as, playing a certain kind of music, but then they evolved into much more artistic and you might say freaky LSD-inspired music. And definitely John's songs, as far as the Beatles go, because John did a lot of LSD, and you can hear the influence quite a lot on his songs, from his songs. And definitely, if you listen to the Grateful Dead, definitely in the 60s, they were quite psychedelic, and they were also they were part of Ken Kesey's acid. They were the house band for Ken Kesey's acid tests in the mid 60s, and I think it's a misconception that the Grateful Dead were high on LSD all the time when they were playing music. I think they realized early on that they could not take LSD and play music. So that's a misconception. Although other artists might have. I've heard that Jimi Hendrix possibly did, but I think it's very challenging to play music when you're that when you're that high. And I think these bands figure that out. But I'm sure there have been musicians. There's the famous story. I'm just thinking of one story of Santana was high on mescaline when he went on at Woodstock, and he played very well, actually. If you listen to him at Woodstock, you can't. It doesn't seem like he was high, but from how he tells it, he was very high, and he was having a hard time. But anyway, the question is, who's the greatest band of all time? A lot of people say it's either, it's between the Beatles and the Stones. Some people would say, the greatest band from the U.S. maybe is the Eagles, right? Because the Eagles also, on paper, had a very big impact and a lot of hits. The Grateful Dead are kind of the polar opposite of the Beatles in many ways, because the Dead are notorious for not having great albums, but having sometimes really amazing live shows. The Beatles obviously stopped doing live shows very early on. I think as early as, was it 65 or 65? When was Shea Stadium? 65 or 66, right? But by the mid 60s, they were done with the live performances. Whereas the Grateful Dead, to this day, they're still going, right? Without Jerry, John Mayer has taken, I guess, is playing a big role. And as far as I know, the Dead are going to keep going, right? So that's one thing to be said for the Dead, is that they have the staying power, and they're still going. Whereas the Beatles have not been playing live for many, many years, except as solo musicians. The Beatles definitely have the goods as far as their records on vinyl. They're immortal, right? Whereas the Dead are considered not to be a great recording band. Although I think it's not true to say that they did not create some really great music on record. All you have to do is look at, right, after the Beatles broke up, they had two great albums, Working Man's Dead and American Beauty, came out in the same year, 1970. That was the year I was born. And I believe Uncle John's Band is on Working Man's Dead. It's a great song. It's a beautiful. It's up there with, I think, with anything that the Beatles did. And obviously, the thing about the Grateful Dead as well is that the Grateful Dead became a kind of a movement and almost like a religion for many people. And maybe is even to this day. The Deadheads, right? Now, in a way, it doesn't. Who really cares who's the greatest and who's they're all great. I think there's so many bands that you could talk about, right? But I think we're getting at like who really has had the biggest impact, and who will continue to have the biggest impact. Obviously, the Beatles have the staying power as well, even though they're not really out there playing live, definitely not as a group, but still Ringo is going strong, Paul's going strong, and John and George will never be forgotten, and the Beatles are a perennial topic of conversation, and if you go on YouTube, for example, you see tons of videos talking about the Beatles and about their music and how they did what they did and how this song was written and what that song was written. I don't know if you are going to find that as much for the Grateful Dead, but you will find that as well. There's a lot to be said on this subject. I would love to hear your thoughts, your comments, just kind of broaching the topic. I am going to write a book. I'm planning on writing a book about the Beatles this year, and I'm definitely going to bring in the Dead into this. Now, one other topic that is of interest is what did the Beatles think of the Grateful Dead, and what did the Grateful Dead think of the Beatles? Well, one thing we know is that the Grateful Dead have played Beatles songs in their live sets, so that says something that that they admired the Beatles. I think Blackbird was one of the songs that I believe they played Get Back. Have to look at all the songs that the Dead have played of the Beatles. Whereas I don't, the Beatles were not that aware of the Grateful Dead as far as I'm aware, right? I think the Beatles knew about the Grateful Dead for sure, but they probably were not very much influenced by them. And I think from what I've read, John did not really listen to his contemporaries that much. The great artists that were his contemporaries. We could also, I think what often gets missed is when talking about the Beatles is how great like Chuck Berry was, and how much of an influence he was, and some other artists of the 50s, including Elvis. Other artists like Buddy Holly, who died young, and what a big impact he probably would have had he lived. And and there would be no Beatles, without this artist. But that's neither here nor there. Here, there, and everywhere. But I think I would love to hear your thoughts on the subject. I think in my mind, because I had that little thing that happened at my camp in 1981 or 82, I forget what year. I really have to look into it and see what year it was. I actually went to that camp for 2 years, so this is the second year I was at the camp, a second summer. Because I had that thing that happened at the camp, for me it's between the Beatles and the Dead. I think they're both great bands. I think they've had maybe the greatest impact of any bands. Those two bands have had the greatest impact of any bands of all time, and that includes the Rolling Stones, and that includes even bands like Led Zeppelin, and think of some of the other great bands. You can name quite a few, right? But I think in terms of like staying power and the immortality of their music and the timeless nature of their music, I think the Grateful Dead and the Beatles are the two for me, and between those two. But I would love to hear your thoughts and your and there will be other amazing bands, and there are even at this right now. So this is not to exclude any other bands. It's just to talk about in the last 50, 60 years, which bands really have had the biggest impact and have had the most staying power and have the most really fan base, you might say, and also influence on other musicians and music as a whole. I would say the Beatles, if you look at in terms of the categories, the Beatles, win. But in terms of just getting at what David Cohen in my cabin was talking about, but he was saying, well, yeah, the Beatles are great, but you may be missing something if you don't consider the Dead. So anyway, thanks for listening, and like I said, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and shine on, rock on. See you soon.